Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to be your host, your moderator for this inaugural event, which is the Zenith Global Economic Forum. And we are discussing a very, very good topic, which is Nigeria is open for business. And I hope you noticed that I'm wearing the colours of the Nigerian flag. Had you noticed that? So I am Zainab Badawi, BBC broadcaster. I'm also chair of the Royal African Society. And of course, for us, anybody who's interested in Africa has, of course, got to be totally engaged with Nigeria because, as we all know, 1 in 5 sub-Saharan Africans is Nigerian. So, chair of this session, which is why manufacturing is a winning economic strategy in Nigeria. And we'll be looking at things such as, obviously, the importance of infrastructure and power and so on. We have government representatives here, and the role of government in encouraging investors to come to Nigeria, and also investors in Nigeria and business people who, you know, want to go about their activities and so on. It's very important that governments create the right kind of enabling environment, regulatory frameworks, proper fiscal governance, that kind of thing. And of course, there are public goods such as infrastructure and so on, which governments have to supply. So from your perspective, from the Good Governance Initiative, just highlight some of the key points you feel are relevant.
Thank you, Zainab. I want to underscore really, before I touch on the issue you've asked around enabling environment and the importance of it. When you look at the story of Aliko Dangote, this is a story of an extremely successful entrepreneur in Africa who made a lot of money as a trader, as an intermediary in trade, attracting finished products into the Nigerian environment. He made a lot of money, but the money he made really pales in comparison to the money he made when he moved into manufacturing. And I think if there's any story that illustrates the power of scale and the power of the manufacturing of, opportunity in Africa, is the Dangote story. Frankly speaking, those who have followed that path, I won't mention names, either from a pure manufacturing standpoint or an industrial standpoint, have also seen transformations in their lives and their affairs. The more important thing for me about manufacturing actually is job creation. And when you look at value chains, when you have strong manufacturers within value chains, you really transform an economy. And that perhaps is probably the strongest opportunity that you can find in Nigeria at this time. And there have been several instances where sectorally our government has got it right. Mm-hmm. One, of course, has been the cement sector. And indeed, actually, even more recently, maybe it's passed in a very quiet way, but just recently, the Demutualization Act of the Nigerian Stock Exchange was passed in record time by the federal government. And it's a unique illustration of the executive, the legislative, and of course the private sector working together to get that going.
To you, Minister of Finance Zainab Ahmed, which is perhaps I know that there are a lot of reforms that have been going on in Nigeria to try to open up the space, to incentivize investments and so on. So perhaps just give us a brief overview of what the government is doing in this area of reforms.
Well, thank you very much, Zainab. We're doing a lot of things in terms of reforms, and the reforms are both monetary as well as physical. I'm glad the CBN governor is here. The business environment in Nigeria has received a lot of attention because when we set out, we decided that we must have a plan that is coherent and that includes all the sectors of the economy. And we realized that there was a need to make sure that the plan is underpinned by the activities of the private sector. So the ERGP, the Nigeria Economic Recovery and Growth Plan, is driven largely by the private sector. The plan is designed to situate government just as an enabler, so that businesses can do what the businesses do best, and we are just there to provide solutions and remove bottlenecks where they exist. In the financial sector, there's a lot of discipline that has been put in place, a lot of rigor to ensure that there's good corporate governance and that there's financial discipline in managing the limited resources that we have as a country. We have introduced a lot of efficiencies in the management of resources, and also measures have been taken to ensure financial sustainability, both in our debt service as well as in revenue. We have clearly articulated in our plan the effort to diversify our economy away from our over-dependence from oil and gas revenues to non-oil sector. So you will see the efforts yielding results in the contribution of the non-oil sector, the increasing contribution of the non-oil sector to our gross domestic product. The last GDP report that was released shows a growth rate of 2.5%, which is the highest that we have attained in a very long time in the non-oil sector. And also, it's instructive that the GDP contribution of the oil sector in Nigeria is actually just 10%. So we're a country that is largely driven by the non-oil sector. We also are a country that is largely driven by the private sector. The government's budget today is just about 10% of the gross domestic product. So it's important for us to continue to engage with businesses to understand what you need so that we can provide the solution.
I can go to the Minister of Power Works and Housing, Minister Babatunde Fashola. So the Minister of Finance there talking about, private sector's role is quite clear, but government's role in removing logistical nightmares and bottlenecks and so on is absolutely critical. And on this issue of infrastructure, that's something which is fundamental to this whole strategy of trying to make manufacturing an important aspect.
As far as infrastructure is concerned, let me first quickly speak to the one that is the hot potato of the day, the power sector. Let me say that this sector has been privatized. It was privatized 5 years ago. November this year will be the 5th anniversary and the performance review occasion for the contracts. And let me also say that privatization has delivered some benefits to the power sector. In the generation side, we are growing our productive capacity to generate power. The transmission side is also increasing. So has the distribution side. But in a value chain where you don't have symphony and coordination, one leaves the other behind. At the moment, in the last 3 years, we have increased power production from 4,000 megawatts to 7,000 megawatts. And this year, there is another 940 coming to be delivered. Next year, 1,115. And these are on-grid supplies only. But where we have the big challenge now is at the 33 kV and 11 kV points where the transmission companies hand over the power to the distribution companies. And that's where the biggest investments have to go today. Now, as my colleague has said, you will go back a long time to find a government that has been so clear in its purpose as saying that our core mission here is to do our job well so that the private sector can do what it does best. You will go back a long time in a team that is so united in that common pursuit that this is a private sector driven economy that we can only lead by laws, regulation, and support and infrastructure. That said, we have started to build out some of the infrastructure that is not commercially viable, like energy, road networks, rail network. And the country, even in its very difficult financial times, is trying to do more with less resources. So major rail networks have commenced, so have road networks, construction, and the target is very clear in our minds, to ease the cost and the time of doing business.
Because I know Jim Ovia in his book talked about, BYOI, build your own infrastructure, which is what a lot of investors and, business people operating at the moment in Nigeria because of the deficits that you've talked about. Minister for Budget and National Planning, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the stage. So really just picking up what your fellow ministers have talked about in terms of, budget allocation and so on. You've got many priorities, but I wonder if you would just give us some insights into how you prioritise your priorities when it comes to attracting investors and bring, this enabling environment we're talking about for the private sector.
I think that the fact that we have 3 ministers and the governor of the central bank here, it shows how seriously we take attracting investment and the private sector. We take it very, very seriously. When we came in as a government, we met a very dire economic situation, an economy that was dependent on crude oil. After extensive consultation with the private sector, with states, with our development partners, and with the National Assembly, we came out with the Economic Recovery and Growth Plan. When that plan was unveiled, it had tremendous support from most people in Nigeria. And because at the center of that plan is partnering with the private sector. The key objectives of the plan are restoring and sustaining growth, investing in our people, and building a competitive economy. We want to change Nigeria from a nation that consumes to a nation that produces and consumes. We want to be the African production powerhouse. And to do this, Nigeria must be competitive. I think that is the key. And we are where we are today in Nigeria, not because we don't have very hardworking people, we do. Not because we don't have natural resources, we do. We are where we are today because Nigeria is not competitive. That really is.
And why isn't it competitive?
And it's not competitive, and I think there are a number of factors. But one at the heart of it is infrastructure deficit. That is at the heart of it. When I used to be chairman of the appropriation committee in the Senate, and the Chinese finance minister was visiting, and we asked him, what are the 3 important things that Nigeria should do if we want to transform and be like China or even better than China? And he said 3. I said just 3, because we would like to concentrate. And he said the first is infrastructure, the second is infrastructure, and the third is infrastructure. Once you get your infrastructure right, other things will follow.
Ladies and gentlemen, my special thanks to all of you. Nigeria is open for business. And this is the beginning. We shall organize a few more of these going forward, and we will be able to measure our success on the basis of how many businesses have truly been enabled through this process